In this episode, we are bringing several big cybersecurity ideas together and turning them into one connected way of thinking that feels much more like real work. Brand new learners often hear about security principles, governance, identity, cloud, and operations as if they are separate topics living in separate lessons. But actual security problems rarely stay inside one box. A decision about data protection can affect access. A decision about access can affect cloud exposure. And a decision about cloud exposure can change what operations teams need to monitor every day. That is why scenario chains matter so much. A scenario chain is a way of following one business activity or one risky event across all those connected areas, so you can see how choices in one place create consequences in another. Once you start thinking in chains instead of fragments, security becomes easier to understand because you are no longer memorizing isolated concepts. You are learning how one decision travels through the whole environment and either strengthens protection or quietly weakens it over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at CyberAuthor.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A scenario chain is not just a made-up story told for training convenience. It is a practical way of tracing cause and effect across the environment so that teams can understand how risk actually moves. You begin with something real, such as an employee needing access to a cloud application, a vendor connecting to shared data, or a business unit launching a new service quickly. Then you ask how that need touches security principles, how governance should guide the decision, how access should be handled, how the cloud service should be configured, and what operations teams will need to see or respond to afterward. In other words, the chain links business purpose to technical design and then links technical design to daily security reality. This is powerful for beginners because it replaces abstract security talk with something much more concrete. Instead of hearing that identity matters or that governance matters, you can watch those topics affect one another step by step. That makes it easier to understand where security succeeds, where it breaks down, and why weak decisions often travel much farther than people expect. Security principles are where many strong scenario chains begin because they answer the basic question of what the organization is trying to preserve before anyone decides how to preserve it. A team may need to protect confidentiality so that sensitive information stays limited to the right people. It may need to protect integrity so that records, approvals, and business decisions cannot be changed in unauthorized ways. It may need to protect availability so that important services remain usable when people depend on them. Those principles sound simple, but they have real influence over later choices. If a scenario involves financial data, confidentiality and integrity may need very strong protection. If it involves a service used during emergencies, availability may take on even greater importance. Principles such as least privilege, separation of duties, and need to know also shape the logic of the chain by reminding the organization that access should be purposeful rather than broad. Without these principles at the beginning, later decisions often become driven by speed and convenience alone, which is how many weak chains quietly begin. Governance gives the scenario chain structure because it defines who owns the risk, who approves changes, what rules apply, and how exceptions are handled when normal practice cannot be followed. Beginners sometimes hear governance and imagine paperwork that sits far away from technical work, but governance is what turns security ideas into accountable decisions. If a business unit wants to move sensitive data into a new cloud application, governance should answer questions about classification, approval, retention, vendor review, access expectations, and who is responsible if the decision creates new exposure. Without governance, teams may still act, but they will act in inconsistent ways. One group may allow broad sharing because it values speed, while another assumes restricted access because it values caution, and no one may notice the conflict until later. Good governance makes the chain visible and intentional. It helps everyone understand that security is not just about what is technically possible. It is also about what has been approved, what obligations exist, and what responsibilities cannot be ignored simply because a project is moving quickly. Identity and access management, IAM, becomes the next major link because it decides who or what can actually perform actions inside the environment. A great many security failures occur not because the wrong system was chosen, but because the right or wrong people were given more access than the situation required. In a scenario chain, IAM translates business purpose into practical trust decisions. Which employees need access? Which contractors need temporary access? Which service accounts need machine-level access? And which administrators should be able to change settings are all questions that belong here. This is why IAM is much more than sign-in support. It shapes whether a person can view sensitive data, whether a service can move records automatically, whether an outside partner can stay connected after a project ends, and whether privileged functions are restricted tightly enough to matter. If IAM is too loose, then good governance and good principles may never reach the real environment. If it is too broad, the whole chain begins to drift toward risk even when the original business goal sounded reasonable. Cloud decisions then amplify whatever was already decided in earlier links of the chain. The cloud is not automatically more secure or less secure than anything else. What it often does is make the effect of good and bad decisions spread faster. A cloud service can store data quickly, share it widely, connect to many other systems, and scale access up or down in a short time. That speed is useful, but it also means overbroad permissions, careless sharing, weak logging, or unclear ownership can create consequences across a much larger space than people expect. A team may believe it is only enabling collaboration, while in reality it is opening paths to sensitive records, creating new external access points, or relying on default settings that were never reviewed against the organization's own needs. In a scenario chain, cloud choices should never appear as a final technical step made after everything else. They should be treated as the place where principles, governance, and IAM become very real, because the cloud turns decisions into operating conditions that affect exposure every day. Operations is where the scenario chain becomes visible in daily life, because operations teams live with the results of all the earlier decisions long after the design meeting has ended. They monitor logs, manage changes, respond to alerts, track assets, review access patterns, investigate unusual activity, and try to keep the environment stable while the business continues moving. If earlier decisions were thoughtful, operations may see clean access patterns, meaningful alerts, and manageable change. If earlier decisions were weak, operations may inherit noisy signals, missing visibility, unclear ownership, and risky configurations that nobody fully understands anymore. This is why operations should not be treated as the cleanup team at the end of the process. Operations needs to be part of the scenario chain from the beginning, because the people who will monitor and respond later often know where visibility breaks, where access becomes confusing, and where cloud changes are likely to create trouble in the real world. A chain is only strong if it still makes sense when it reaches daily use. And operations is the test of whether all the earlier logic survives contact with reality. A simple scenario makes all of this easier to picture. Imagine an organization wants to launch a cloud-based workspace where internal employees and outside vendors can collaborate on documents tied to product development. The business need sounds reasonable, and the value is clear because faster collaboration may shorten timelines and reduce confusion. Now the scenario chain begins. Security principles ask what kinds of information will be stored there, how sensitive that information is, and whether confidentiality or integrity carries the greater concern. Governance then asks who is allowed to approve the platform, what contractual or policy obligations apply, how long information should remain there, and whether outside vendor access creates new review requirements. IAM asks which users need ongoing access, which users need temporary access, what roles should be separated, and whether privileged administration should be tightly limited. Cloud decisions then determine where data is stored, how sharing works, what default settings exist, and whether logging and monitoring are turned on in ways operations can actually use later. Now imagine the same scenario chain built carelessly. The organization moves fast because the tool looks convenient and other teams already like it. Governance review is treated as a delay instead of as a control, so the project team approves broad external collaboration with little discussion of data sensitivity. IAM is set up quickly, with large role groups and generous permissions because nobody wants vendors to be blocked from getting work done. The cloud platform is left close to its default sharing model, which makes document exchange easy, but also allows links and folders to travel farther than intended. Operations is told only that a new collaboration service is live, but the team is not given clear expectations about what activities should be logged, what alerts matter most, or which data sets inside the workspace are especially sensitive. Nothing catastrophic has happened yet, but the chain is already weak. The principles were not translated into governance. Governance did not shape IAM carefully enough. Cloud settings reflected convenience more than trust, and operations inherited a service it can see only partially. A few weeks later, the weak chain starts to show real consequences. A contractor account that should have remained limited is still active after one project ended and was quietly added to a broad access group during another project. That account begins downloading a larger number of files than usual from the cloud workspace, including design documents that contain sensitive internal plans. Because sharing rules were permissive, some material had also been copied into folders that mixed vendor collaboration with employee-only work. The downloads are technically visible somewhere, but the logging was never tuned around the organization's real priorities, so operations sees fragments rather than a clear signal. A cloud administrator notices unusual activity only after a business manager asks why certain files appear to have moved unexpectedly. What looks at first like an access issue is actually the result of a broken scenario chain. Weak governance allowed the service to launch without tight rules. Loose IAM expanded trust too broadly. Cloud choices increased exposure, and operations was left without the context needed to recognize the problem early enough to reduce harm. The value of scenario chains is that they can also be used to build stronger environments before those problems appear. In the same collaboration example, the organization could begin with a clearer understanding that product development documents carry higher confidentiality needs than general project notes. Governance could require approval for vendor access to that category of data and define retention and ownership before the workspace goes live. IAM could separate internal contributors, outside vendors, and administrators into narrower roles, with time-limited access for non-employees and more deliberate review of changes to privileged groups. The cloud platform could be configured so that external sharing is restricted by default. Highly sensitive folders are segmented more carefully, and meaningful logging is enabled for downloads, permission changes, and external access patterns. Operations could then be told exactly which behaviors matter, what normal vendor activity should look like, and who must be contacted if certain patterns appear. In that stronger chain, the business still gets collaboration, but the collaboration is built on connected decisions rather than on a pile of assumptions. This connected thinking also improves communication across teams because it gives everyone a shared story instead of 5 separate conversations. Leadership can understand why the business need does not stand apart from the security principles. Governance teams can see how their approvals affect real access and cloud exposure rather than only paperwork. Identity teams can understand that access design is not a standalone task, but a reflection of data sensitivity and policy intent. Cloud teams can see that configuration choices are not neutral technical preferences because they decide how trust behaves in practice. Operations teams can explain their monitoring needs earlier because they already understand the role of the service in the larger chain. For beginners, this is one of the biggest benefits of scenario thinking. It turns security from a loose collection of expert opinions into a shared narrative where each decision has a visible effect on the next one. That makes cross-team work calmer, clearer, and more honest because everyone can see how their part contributes to the full outcome. Scenario chains are also extremely useful during incident response because a real event rarely begins at the point where the alert becomes visible. When suspicious activity appears, responders need to understand what data is at stake, which identities are involved, what governance rules apply, how the cloud service is configured, and what operations has already observed. If those domains were never linked mentally before the incident, the response team must reconstruct the chain while the pressure is already high. If the organization already thinks in chains, the response becomes more coherent. People know which approvals matter, which access groups deserve immediate review, which cloud settings may have widened exposure, and what operational signals should confirm or challenge the initial concern. That is one reason scenario chains help both prevention and response. They do not simply tell a story about what might go wrong. They prepare people to recognize how one problem likely connected to earlier design decisions, which makes containment, investigation, and learning much more grounded in reality. There are a few misconceptions that can make this kind of thinking seem harder than it really is. One is the idea that scenario chains are only for large organizations with many formal teams and a great deal of process. In truth, even a small organization still has data, identities, cloud services, and operational responsibilities, so the need to connect those decisions is still there. Another misconception is that building scenario chains means predicting every possible incident in detail. That is not the goal. The goal is to trace how trust, access, configuration, ownership, and monitoring interact so that important weak points are seen earlier. A third misconception is that governance and operations sit at opposite ends of the conversation, with one creating rules and the other dealing with reality. Strong scenario chains show the opposite. Governance without operational awareness becomes detached, while operations without governance becomes reactive. Beginners should take confidence from that idea because it means better security often starts not with a perfect answer, but with better connected questions asked early enough to shape the chain. As we close, the main lesson is that scenario chains help you connect security principles, governance, IAM, cloud, and operations into one practical way of thinking about how real environments work. Principles define what must be protected, governance makes that protection accountable, IAM decides who can act, cloud turns those decisions into live services and exposure, and operations lives with the results every day through monitoring, change, and response. If any one of those areas is handled in isolation, the chain weakens and risk travels farther than expected. If they are linked thoughtfully, the organization becomes much easier to protect because trust, access, visibility, and responsibility all support one another. For a brand new learner, that is the real power of this topic. It teaches that good security is not built from isolated controls stacked side by side. It is built from connected decisions that still make sense when they travel all the way from business need to cloud deployment to everyday operational reality.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.